Welcome to my talk on communism. Everybody got their communist manifesto handy? Turn to page 46. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just gonna talk off the slides. I'm gonna try to deliver one simple point at a time. The first one, kind of a title page, just shows the kind of relationship and the difference between socialism and communism, because they're often conflated. Even since its origins and its inceptions, the idea of communism, because we lived in feudal times and capitalist times, and it was always oppressive, but there was a kind of sense of an alternative, and in deep history there was different ways of organizing economies and society and being more egalitarian. So, but in Marx's time and in our time today, still, communism is the horizon. That doesn't mean we'll never reach it. In fact, the theory of communism is that it is evolutionary, and it's a stage beyond socialism and beyond capitalism. So the way I approach this too is that I'm both a socialist and a communist. The socialist part of me is more kind of grounded in the reality of the political moment and what policies are popular and what people can understand. So socialism is these things like universal healthcare, workers' rights, affordable housing, the New Deal, a Green New Deal, economic equality, democratic reforms. Socialism's been around for a long time, and it's been a key part of American history and world history. I say American history just because it's been suppressed, and so people don't know a lot about it. But communism is more radical. It's more avant-garde. It's more forward-looking. And it's harder. It's harder to do from the ground up and to impose from the top down. And there's pros and cons and trade-offs in trying to implement that. But if we understand it in terms of horizon and the various movements of abolitionism and various movements of liberation, it becomes a salient and valuable and integrous attractor. So that's where we'll start. And this is kind of the same thing, just kind of helps visualize those things I just said a little better, how they converge into a movement of socialism and towards that advanced horizon. So it's important to understand these things as stages and as factions of society in tension with each other. Right, so we're ruled by capitalism, private domination, profit rule, class hierarchy, accumulation, market coercion, not necessarily free markets, but manipulated markets, monopolies, stuff like that. And socialism is about moving things into public and collective control, where think of like the big tech giants, right, where the wealth that they extract and accumulate is actually should be a public utility. It's something we all, contribute to and use and should benefit from. And so much of the game of capitalism and business is just manipulating laws to make it legal to extract more wealth to the owner class and the managerial class. Decommodification, democratic planning, institutional reform, right? These are the things we talk about and do under socialism. And the goal now and the goal today, perhaps, is not to, make you all comrades and radicalize you all. That might be too tall of an order, too high of an expectation, too big of an ask, because it's something you have to sacrifice a lot. You have to spend the time investing in that material and consciousness. You have to kind of stick your neck out to critique and advocate. And this is why communists get killed as well. Just a heads up too, I'm going to briefly talk about the failures and the downsides and the dark sides and whatever of communism. But obviously I'm advocating communism, and I'm trying to show that a lot of that has been misrepresented. So we'll just go on to the next slide. So anti-communism, this is why I put this up front. People probably think they know more about communism than they actually know about anti-communism. And that really scares me, because the more you learn about anti-communism, the more you understand how naive and hegemonic and murderous capitalism is, and capitalists can be, and its union with far-right ideology and fascism, and how that translates directly to, if you look at the bottom, things like McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, coups, Operation Condor, which saw the murder of 70,000 leftists across Latin America, sanctions, blacklisting, and ideological distortion. So it's not abstract. It's anti-communism is a very real part of history and a very real problem in our current discourse and policy climate. What is it? It creates fear and demonization. It treats equality as tyranny and class politics as dangerous. It frames capitalism as normal, natural, and free. It says all these things. It collapses these things into slogans like, I don't want to be homogenous, I don't want to lose my individuality. But a lot of those are tropes that actually, communism doesn't really threaten. What else does anti-communism do? It criminalizes communism. It criminalizes certain types of radicalism, parties, unions, and organizing. And it violently opposes it. Blacklists, censors, arrests, infiltrates, kills, supports coups, dirty wars, sanctions, proxy war. So I frame the entire Cold War, and increasingly so, and I think a lot of people do as time goes on, as one giant misadventure that is still going on, because instead of dealing with the complexity of human philosophy and ways of living and difference and the desire for solidarity and equality, it tries to micromanage everything through the architecture of threat. And that's why I talk about the military industrial complex. So just before I go further, for anybody who came to my other talks, right, this is kind of a series. They're all connected. So I started with paradigm drift, how the world at large and our communities get our paradigm shift hijacked, and we're complicit in that. And we need to tackle that head on. I tried to provide very clear maps of how we can do that. And then systemic conspiracy gives kind of the tools of deconstructing power and the language of differentiating between very ludicrous, magical thinking, sort of conspiracy theory that is a term that was created to disparage, critical thinking and Marxism, but there's a lot of BS, right? So we want to differentiate from that and the official versions of things and overly abstracted and sanitized narratives and organizations that rule the world, right? So like, what damage does the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund or, the Trilateral Commission, like these organizations that claim some legitimacy in global governance but some that have conspiratorial overtones, like how do we differentiate? How do we overcome not just the narratives, but the system itself? And Israel politique, the Zionist kind of aspect of the military industrial complex, as being a major case study of that. And what do we do about that? And finally, communism. And one way those last three are connected, at least, is through the diversity of, I call it the Jewish political field in a later slide, but the actual diversity there, rather than flattening all of that, right? And so it's very important to highlight that, of course, Karl Marx was a Jew. So what does anti-communism actually produce, right? It produces a world where socialist possibilities are strangled early. I talk about the political imagination and how it's suffocated and we're blinded to what's possible. We're subtly coerced into using different language and vocabulary. And that vocabulary can, extinguish the flame within. It can mute and suppress our liberatory and socialist and revolutionary instincts and abilities. It creates a memory field tilted towards capitalism. And I hope you can just see it. You know what I'm talking about, and all the dogma and talking points that accompany this pattern of history, right? Again, at the bottom, McCarthyism, COINTELPRO. So the key claim is that anti-communism is one of the main reasons communism appears only as trauma, only as taboo and failure in the dominant public memory. Like, 100 million killed under communism. Well, as I'm going to explain a little bit, a reasonable low estimate of how many people capitalism has killed just in the 20th century would be 200 million. So we need to be really honest about that and just confront propaganda with facts. And that's not to sanitize communism, right? It's just to have a more mature understanding. So most people are taught to fear a word they can't define. So this anti-communist brainwashing creates yet another enclosure and monetizes our consciousness, creates fear and ignorance, and the media is complicit in that because it's very privatized, very owned, and they have interests, and it creates this loop, right, of hate and fear, and it's self-reinforcing. The people become their own surveillors in a kind of panopticon kind of way. But let's reset our minds. Let's deconstruct the word semantically, etymologically, right? What does communism have in common with the commons or community, communal, communion, communication? It's not accidental, right? So communism is just a philosophy in the first instance that is both an affirmation of capitalism and its productive abilities and a critique and a prediction and a normative prediction about the evolution of these systems, especially if we play a role in that evolution rather than just passively sit back and try to let it happen. So this is, again, I want to highlight communists, even if they've never had real political power in the West, whereas in Soviet Union and China and Cuba, that became the dominant kind of system. But in the West, by and large, we have anti-communism, but they've still helped shape the modern world, participated in major revolutions and uprisings, often globally, right, in a very cosmopolitan way, influenced global politics, played a key role in anti-colonial struggles, promoted labor rights and anti-fascism. And this is why fascists and capitalists started World War I and World War II, in part against communists, preemptively. So, here it is more named, more visual, more visceral, right? These people existed. Don't forget who they are, go back and learn who they are. Be a revisionist like I've been. So you keep learning and you shift yourself, you grow. There's a very interesting timelines if we break these things down. And W.E.B. Du Bois is the father of what's called the Atlanta School of Sociology. And he formed the NAACP and just was very successful in a time, when that was so much harder. I mean, it would be cool to do a talk on each of these slides. There's so much potential depth. And kind of related to that anti-communism, a lot of us make excuses to protect the system, whether we're defending capitalism or attacking communism. And that just is thought terminating cliches. That kills the dialectic. Capitalism's got its problems, but communism is worse. Well, that's a gross oversimplification and frankly is wrong. And if we're able to normalize what I'm saying, again, it's an attractor, it's a horizon, because communism is really, as a praxis and a theory, is for the radicals. It helps us normalize and enact socialism and get the policies and the norms in society that we want for ourselves and for everybody. So it's more egalitarian, it's more fair. And yeah, unfortunately, we can distill a lot of the problems in society to capital. And as I say, linking it to conspiracy, as Eisenhower said, the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. So there's a difference between theoretical communism and actually existing communism, but it's not problematic as you would think. To compare China and the United States, there's some ways and some metrics that the United States wins. And the sort of freedom index, even though the United States is very still racist and unequal, and especially now with all the far right and manosphere kind of stuff, it's really bad. But there's sort of a legal framework and sort of a high tolerance for free speech and stuff like that, even if it's neutralized. But China wins on clean energy, housing, universal health care, transportation infrastructure, right? It's no contest. And so maybe, countries can learn from each other, if nothing else. But I've always believed that America has its own tradition and legacy of revolutionary thought and needs to grow up and have it on its own terms. And I think a community like this matters, that we move and organize and have some leverage. This slide explains the same thing in more detail. There's a lot too much text there, so I apologize. So I didn't really know where to put this slide, but this is important. This is a scholar named Gabriel Rockhill, who published a book in the last year or two called "Who Paid the Pied Pipers of Western Marxism?" And basically it boils down to in the global South, in these the East, if you will, these countries that did go communist, like China and the Soviet Union, had sort of revolutions for better and worse. But America opposed and resisted that, and so did the intellectual discourse. Basically a norm of anti-imperialist Marxism, which, long story short, the theory gains prestige as praxis loses force. And there's so much to teach there. It's endlessly interesting, and there's lots of debates. But what Rockhill uncovers, and it ruffles a lot of feathers, is that there's a type of drift, as I call it, and capture. And it's corralled into what is called the compatible left. And this is why you have somebody like Chomsky, who's celebrated as a leftist intellectual and a liberal, and he's a founder of the New Left in the 60s, but he's actually not as radical as one would think and as one would want. So we end up getting trapped and kind of disabled. And even though he was very pro-Bernie when all that was happening, the idea of a deeper revolution and a faith and trust in the American people to become literate in that and take action was always framed with an air of skepticism or pessimism that it won't work or it's too dangerous. So Rockhill's been making the rounds on leftist podcasts because he speaks to this very eloquently, and there's a lot of depth there. So as a leftist, myself, but anybody who wants to be a leftist should want to lean into this and embrace the critique. It's a critique of the left, right? It's a way to overcome our shortcomings. I don't think I'm even doing it justice, but hopefully you're absorbing something from the slide, and you'll want to look into these things, because I'm another high level overview. I'm gonna just be dumping a lot of information. There's a lot of myths, right? Communism erases individuality. Well, you can't even have individuality proper if you don't have a healthy, relatively egalitarian society. Individual development requires collective security. The phrase judge a country or society by how it treats the lower classes or the the least of us. And the type of individualism we have under capitalism is a lot of atomized, isolated consumerism, right? And the loneliness epidemic and all that, right? So how's that working out? That's not real individualism. That's kind of performative, narcissistic, every man for himself, right? So that's a myth that a lot of people carry around and embody and repeat, and we can kind of debunk that and say, no, it doesn't erase your individuality. If anything, it enables it. Communism forces everyone to work. That's not true either. It reframes the nature of work. It reallocates the collective windfall of all of our work, right? We're already actually under capitalism forced to work as kind of wage slaves or debt slaves or indentured, servitude, and having to pay high rent and taxes and stuff, right? So we're already kind of compelled to work. Again, on the communist horizon, and especially in a post-scarcity, kind of automated future, which is where this ends today, the nature of work gets redefined. Work becomes contribution, not survival. Marx called kind of one's relationship to work species being, and through capitalism, you're alienated from that. Like if you're in an assembly line, you're only making one small part of it, and it's a very abstract process, and you're only paid as minimum as they, will pay you, and it becomes meaningless. That's why there's also revivals of like craftsmanship and gardening. We as human beings can feel more directly connected to work, and the service economy is the biggest sector, and that's not going away anytime soon, even though a lot of it will be replaced by automation. But we should embrace that, right? With higher wages, and it's literally people taking care of each other, and there's dignity in that. Communism takes your property. Well, not all property, like you still have personal possessions and, maybe even some personal land property. But by and large, we want to reclaim the commons and make housing and land available to everybody, right? Because capitalism actually encloses it. How about the myth that communism means total control? Well, coordination does not equal domination. And again, like China made mistakes, the Soviet Union made mistakes. We can discuss those, but let's discuss those in context of the Cold War, or in context of abuses within communism, and in historical settings when these things were still being figured out and the outcomes of struggle. But the necessary reality is that democratic planning can and should replace market coercion. So this is a reality check about what capitalism actually does: isolates individuals, privatizes production, creates competition for necessities. Communism supports individuality, guarantees material security, and that's not a pipe dream. We create abundance, and that gets hoarded and seized and stolen. Communism socializes production and enables cooperation. So again, think of it as a horizon for the radicals, and socialism is the middle ground, the short-term goal, and we should want to see more people converge into socialist parties and get wins, and institute a lot of these policies that are long overdue. So I put this slide up because there's something called New Communism, because like with the New Left in the 60s, things go through phases and renewals. So Slavoj Žižek is a new communist. He's part of this movement. And there's an article from 2012. I actually have it open, so it's right here. It's called The New Communism, Resurrecting the Utopian Delusion by Alan Johnson. Well, why is it called that? Why is he calling it a utopian delusion? Because Alan Johnson is actually sort of an ex-leftist who's also a Zionist and sort of moved in that direction. And for one reason or another, he's compromising and selling out and being propagandized in his own way by ideology and whatnot. So he's moving. The interesting thing about his article is, in trying to critique New Communism specifically, he actually makes it look kind of cool. He says a lot of the things I'm saying in a very scholarly way. He summarizes what a lot of the new communists, like Zizek and many others, say and think. And he quotes them, and he actually makes it sound cool. Because Alan Johnson is wrong. That's what I'm saying. You know, he's a Zionist. He's leaning into the other side of things. And like a lot of those kind of conservative or libertarian thinkers, they kind of lose sight of the big picture if they ever saw it. So they get stuck in the weeds of these debates just as much as anybody else. And you see on the right there, Johnson's frame, it's left totalitarianism, it's religious dogma, it's anti-democratic. So Johnson is actually a victim of the anti-communist discourse that I was talking about earlier. He's repeating all these talking points without enough actual depth and context. And the distortion move, it collapses the historical need for communism into a moral panic. But go back to the left, to the conditions of return, right? Johnson does name, as the new communists do as well, the capitalist crisis, the ecological emergency, the hollowing out of democracy, failure of reformism, and the search for systemic alternatives. So he acknowledges all that. And then he cites all these communists as recognizing that and pursuing that. But ultimately, there's a kind of dismissiveness that is common, that it's like, oh, this idealism will never work, and we got to just keep pushing with capitalism. We're almost there. And that was in 2012, right? So think about how things have evolved or devolved since then, how they've changed. So I think the new communists are right. And it doesn't mean that they're all perfect, but they're certainly not understood, you know. And somebody like Zizek, who writes a ton of books and has a very iconoclastic and eccentric speaking style, it doesn't resonate with everybody. It's very complex. It takes a long time to get into the weeds of that. And I'm trying to simplify that, you know, when we talk about the commons and systemic critique and the post-neoliberal horizon and collective, like, you're doing communism. It's not the old state communism, but we can learn from that. We can converge all these lessons and these policies and aspirations and actually win some elections, change some hearts and minds. In the beginning, if you will, you know, there was the commons, shared land, care, knowledge, not to overly romanticize it, but that's the state of nature. And it became privatized and priced and marketized and commodified. And that's what we're in now. That's the norm. That's capitalist realism. But communism, right, discovering these things through a life of oppression, of being oppressed, recognizes the need to reverse a lot of that commodification. And now we're going back to the commons ideal. We're reclaiming the commons, democratic provision for all. So, and David Graeber has a wonderful quote. Marx talked about primitive communism, but David Graeber said basically we're all de facto communists in our day-to-day lives sometimes, right? Maybe you don't think about this, but you're not profiting off anything when you share food, when you know, lend a hand to help somebody do something, engage in community projects, free advice, open source knowledge, right? Taking care of your neighbors, very Christian sort of ideal. Is it that hard of a pill to swallow to call that de facto communism? So we take all these things like mutual aid, degrowth, post-capitalism, collective economy, whatever. There's a lot of phrases, a lot of ideas that have flourished in all this sense-making, change-making kind of lifestyle and discourse. It avoids communism because it's convenient, because communism is scary, and it's radical. Like I said, you're putting yourself at risk just by participating in it and being misunderstood. It takes courage to stand for those things, to learn all the complexities. So what is the price we pay by avoiding that connection? Is it worth the price? Are we achieving our ends, our goals? Because it seems like history has been stretched out and delayed, and like we're long overdue to achieve some of these things. Again, especially since in the past 10, 15, 20 years, economic equality has worsened, climate action has been disabled. We can coordinate momentarily and on specific things like fixing the ozone layer. But that's because doing that did not really threaten capitalism as a whole. And it was literally a patch solution, kind of band-aid to a particular problem, when with climate, what we have is a systemic problem, a very complex system being stabilized both through, destabilized both through natural processes and anthropogenic causes. So by avoiding communism, we miss these connections, we erase history, we forget struggles and ideas, and we speak to the wrong audience. We end up, appeasing the anti-communist crowd. Okay, the next 5 slides kind of are all simplifications, and the middle and the core of this talk, building off what I was just saying, in these spaces and on the left, essentially, regardless of how you identify politically, or if you want to avoid politics, we have fragmented care, community hub, local campaign, community garden, pop-up action, pamphlets, protests, mutual aid, the nonprofit complex. And as much as we try to coordinate and tell ourselves that we are coordinating, it's very fragmented, it's very incoherent, it's very disempowered. And capital, the state, and the hegemony of that is more of a solid block. I don't even need to show it. When you look at like those diagrams of, say, corporations and what conglomerates own each other, right? It's all kind of a monopoly at the top. Like 5 companies own 99% of the products in a grocery store. So you're just overwhelmed by the illusion of choice. And those corporations, those theocratic rulers, those investors, they all get along a lot better. Sometimes people speak also about the comfort on the political right of they organize so well and they look past each other's differences. Well, these are part of the reasons. And the left is pitted against each other with all this lack of funding and weakness and diversity, both as a strength and a challenge. So why does this keep repeating? Because our concerns go into local efforts or small projects, which go into trust building. Maybe you grow your organization, but then eventually it's captured, it's co-opted, it's astroturfed. The more you sanitize your message, the more appealing it's going to be for big business partners to fund it, whether it's charity or philanthropy. Right? Capitalists are almost always buying optics and laundering themselves. That was true throughout the history of this kind of thing. And Anand Giridharadas blew up in fame some years back for Winners Take All, which was literally about that, how just philanthropy is image laundering. And it doesn't really contribute to change because it's still within that capitalist complex. So what's missing for scale and unification? Like, what's the problem? Well, there's no shared analysis in these change-making ecosystems. There's no federation. There's no common program. Mass movements, giant protests and stuff often go unreported or they get captured. I think Black Lives Matter itself is kind of a famous example of some capture. It started in 2014, I think, for all the right reasons, and became a big popular organization. And not only was that nonprofit energy kind of captured and deflected, but the messaging itself was counteracted. Like Biden's big move was to paint it on the streets without any systemic change. And then Trump's counter move was not only to erase it from the streets, but, push a further white supremacist agenda and Project 2025 and things like this. So what we have is pluralism without analysis. we kind of fetishize each other's perspectives and autonomy, and we say, well, let's get away from labels. It divides people. We don't want to erase that pluralism, and I certainly don't want to coerce that diversity into convergence, right? I want it to happen organically, and it is always happening organically. And I'm hoping the more I name it and show it historically, that people want to do that. They choose to pursue it. And what does that look like in practical terms? Naming capitalism and all of its constituent parts that do damage, doing class analysis, doing socialism. I came up with the phrase like less chattering classes, more mattering class consciousness, so we can have common knowledge and common cause, and not the just assumption or the implication that we're all doing the same thing and we're all going to get there one day. But we can organize a little better. Grass is not yet a movement. A lot of local tiny efforts, grass spread, it has strong roots, but is it performative? Is it getting astroturfed? Can we even tell the difference anymore? These terms like grassroots become floating signifiers, like they don't mean anything anymore. Or they are still inspiring, but they're captured. We need to think way more creatively. Like I've always loved the metaphor or analogy of rhizomes and mushrooms and mycelial networks as also not instead of grassroots, but as a companion term. I like to extend the metaphor of grass as well, because you make rope out of grass and you can build things with rope. You can fertilize things with grass clippings. Like we can do things, and we can build the rope into strategy and memory and coordination, and then eventually a program that we all like and agree to and consent to, not an authoritarian one that's not going to work, but something that is literally the combination and integration and synthesis of all of our different efforts. So this also kind of visualizes that, from fragmentation to counterpower. So at the bottom, we have recognition, convergence, common program, mass movement. And maybe I'll say something about the No Kings protest as well, because these things always have, multiple aspects to them. Like it's largely anti-Trump in its origins. It's evolved, but it's also a little bit astroturfed. It's a little bit sponsored by George Soros and people like that, for better or for worse. I'm not throwing him under the bus, but he's very much just a centrist and a capitalist. But he's a liberal, progressive one of those. So, we just have to understand that and take it for what it's worth. So those types of protests, as big as they get, can mean different things to different people and have different outcomes. But by and large, it's better to have that than to not have that, and to all be continually, through critique and more, figuring out and improving these things. So just in a broad sense, I argue for convergence a lot, and I wanted to kind of visualize that. So this kind of shows the last 5 slides I just showed. So to kind of repeat myself, to drive it home, we start with caring and doing something about that, but it's fragmented. And we're up against concentrated power, capitalism. We have to recognize that. So we get stuck in loops because that's captured, and we have pluralism without analysis. This is something I raise a lot and critique and complain about a lot. It's not really a problem on the explicit left, on the socialist left. They lead with that, but I think it scares away a lot of people as well. So I'm trying to make that feel safer. I'm trying to incentivize marrying deeper analysis with your progressive pluralistic ethos, and building a common sense, which we're doing through grassroots efforts. But then even that's not enough. It tends to get captured in drift and grift lanes. Again, we get stuck in this cycle. We don't get paradigm shift. Basically, the billionaires and their pundit class keep winning. They keep asserting their dogma over more diverse truths. What did communist states do wrong? I didn't really know where to put this. Maybe I should have put it more up front and just got it out of the way. But as I said earlier, like there's a kind of talking point that communism killed 100 million people. If you take World War I and II alone, it killed 120 million people. but there's a lot of data to support just continued mass death from no access to water or limited access to water. Things like that, like pollution, still affects a lot of people all over the world. Things like alienation and anxiety actually are leading contributors to not just mental illness, but death, heart disease, and things like that in the United States are major killers. And not to mention all the anti-communist, death squads that adds up as well. So we can very reasonably claim that capitalism kills a lot of people and covers it up. But that aside, there's all these other lanes where these mass projects go wrong. Industrialization and collectivization too fast, coercion, impossible targets, policy error could become famine. And really understanding those things require some deep dives and some expertise. Like there's, India is a great case study because the British ruled it for so long and they had a very high population and a lot of mass death. And a lot of that, India was capitalist when China was going communist. And so a lot of that can be attributed just to colonial rule still. And not to mention, slavery and genocide, which in the United States go back a little further than the time horizon we're typically comparing with communism. Other problems are information flows get compromised. Leaders stop hearing bad news. Dissent looks like sabotage. There's censorship and repression. Party, state, and police get fused together. Worker control is weakened. Purity politics and social engineering. My point, though, is the more we know, we can actually address these things. The key claim at the bottom: communist state atrocities were not inevitable expressions of evil communism, which is what we're told. They were historical failures of socialist construction under pressure, compounded by authoritarian choices. I'm not trying to spin anything. The reframing is actually more true, and it helps us empathize and understand these projects more constructively and what we need to do in the West. Systemic conspiracy and communism, right? Capitalism teaches us that communism is the evil conspiracy. And popular conspiracy theory looks for secret plots, bad actors, focuses on scandals, sometimes misses the underlying structural logic. Marxist analysis can become a kind of X-ray to analyze capitalism's pathologies, profit extraction and enclosure and empire. So the core claim at the bottom there, communism is not the conspiracy. It exposes the real one of capitalism, a system that hides its violence behind normality, right? So the coming back to the image, the capitalist response to conspiracy is to demonize and caricature communism, and that produces an ideological result, which is people inherit a distorted image of communism. Even the symbol, the hammer and sickle, I always just associated with the Soviet Union, which is, what it is. But that can be, counterproductive or inappropriate to just import those images, merge it with an American flag or something. But people do that anyways. But what it actually kind of represents at its root is like worker power, like in industry and agriculture. Like those are foundations of life in a sense. So it is about kind of reclaiming those things, ideally, right? But I'm not too attached to the symbols personally. So this one, it kind of connects with the Israel politique. Like if we think of, and communism is not reducible to Karl Marx or Jewish approaches to these things. But I thought this would be an interesting map and slide. And I even noted while I was making it, this could be really great, or this could be kind of a mess, right? But I think for the most part, it makes sense and it tracks with my paradigm drift slides and quadrants. But anyways, if you look on the lower left axis of who's capitalist and Zionist, the Likud party, State of Israel, and the settler capital that funds it, and AIPAC, the group of groups of the Israel lobby. And on the other side of that, Jewish Labor Bund and Matzpen, and these are traditions, these are organizations that are Jewish, anti-Zionist, and pro-socialist. And what this shows is that you can have it all, and we shouldn't want it all, but I'm saying in reality, to give ourselves a reality check, we have it all. Like Israel has kibbutzes, which are essentially communes, and they are hailed as very successful. And you have labor Zionism, right? So it's merging that collective form, that worker power, and nationalist containment. But there's all sorts of ways these things can go wrong. Again, what I'm advocating for is what Michael Brooks, a Jew, called cosmopolitan socialism. And this is longstanding, internationalism, the internationale. And it's that communists think more globally and collectively, but not in a globalist, capitalist kind of way. They see all of our struggles as interconnected, because they are, and, try to synthesize and try to practice these things. Matzpen was, I don't think it's operational anymore, but it was a, obviously, Jewish, communist, anti-Zionist movement within Israel that emerged out of the 6-Day War in the 60s, when Israel was expanding violently. So I just thought that was interesting. Okay, communism in popular culture. I love this slide. This is a great way for us all to connect. Some of these I haven't seen. I've never seen Reds, but under the direct communism one, I've seen Trumbo. I love that movie. Bryan Cranston. Judas and the Black Messiah is about, Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, and just super important stuff, real history. One I would put on here somewhere as well from the last few years is Oppenheimer. A huge part of that narrative. They jumped around a lot, but I want to call it kind of the main plot, or at least the secondary subplot behind the bomb itself, was the kind of the mock trial and kind of witch hunt against communists that put Oppenheimer himself kind of in jeopardy the entire time, right in that context of World War II and post-World War II and the Red Scare, McCarthyism of the 50s. The movie does interesting things with that. And Albert Einstein's there. Einstein was a socialist who refused the presidency of Israel. What else is missing from a list like this? Zootopia, Star Wars. Yeah, actually Star Wars should have been on here. And let me just clarify, right? Because George Lucas said the rebels were the Viet Cong, right? Which were communists. It's subversive. It's weaved into storytelling. It's owned by Disney now. It's part of pop culture. The series Andor and the prequel Rogue One are the most radical products of Star Wars to date. They really explore and unpack in a very meaningful way, revolutionary struggle and sacrifice. And I don't want people to think of these as entertainment products. They're liberatory tools, and there's different categories. And when I talk about fully automated luxury communism, which will be the last slide, that's like Star Trek: The Next Generation. Granted, that's, 400 years in the future and very fantastical, but just the way of living where they're not motivated by money, they're motivated by challenge and solidarity and curiosity. Even with all our basic needs met in life, there's still a lot of challenges. So we should want to design a utopia. A real utopia is not just a kind of permanent vacation where you go crazy eventually. It's a new context and horizon of meaning and working together, because there's always work to do. So the eco-village, we all want to live in an eco-village, right? For various reasons, to have a community, to generate our own power, electricity, renewably, sustainably, solar, wind, and whatever else, biofuels. We want to learn how to do that stuff that capitalism has not made easy or accessible, especially with mass big agro, right? So intentional communities, regenerative living, shared stewardship, holistic governance, conscious community, like at the beginning of this talk, like all these terms, where do they come from? What are they pointing towards? Well, they address the same underlying questions as communist language, right? Is an eco-village not a commune? If we can call it a commune, does that make us communists? And what is the difference in practice between an eco-village ran by reactionaries, isolationists, anti-woke people? How would that work? It wouldn't work. What would that look like? But there's examples of this. So the communist language, prefigurative politics, that's something I really like and think about a lot. And that's what this long-term communist struggle is about. The eco-village also creates sort of a lifestyle enclave, individual exit, consumer spirituality, and low political clarity. And maybe they feel like necessary things for some people. They're convenient, but I'm trying to name the price. What is the trade-off? And at the bottom there, without political language, the commune appears as lifestyle. With political language, it becomes praxis. And this is why I studied politics and society, so I could have that language and that expertise. I'm not a life coach or a business coach. I'm not a engineer. I'm not a doctor. I am not so many things and so many of the other valuable roles and career paths in these communities. But I'm a scholar activist, and I've climbed the mountain to get the language. I'm still learning, and I want that language and that path to be understood. So we can take that lifestyle enclave and understand it as cooperative settlement, shared infrastructure, partial governance, mixed property relations, towards what it is, a commune, a collective reproduction of life, a micro-experiment, explicit anti-capitalist direction, and that political consciousness. It's something we have to do both individually, like how each of you go and choose now what movies you're going to watch, what books you're going to read. That's partly individual, but it's also you're joining a collective struggle. So you can do that with other people and with groups, do it with me, and then you'll feel more at home when you join or you watch online these mass movements all around the world. Finally, I have one slide for the spiritual aspect. So the term meta-communism was actually coined by this guy, Kazantzakis. I think his name's Nikos Kazantzakis, over 100 years ago. And like I said in my conspiracy talk, I think the term open conspiracy was coined by H.G. Wells over 100 years ago. So there's long-standing precedents for this. And Kazantzakis' meta-communism was a really interesting idea, and he expressed it through his works, his novels, his poetry. For him, it was a spiritual thing more than a political thing. And so this is where it can intersect with people's spiritual journeys and development and liberation theology. Kazantzakis defined metacommunism in spiritual terms as human development, self-overcoming. It's not the end, it's the vehicle, the passage, the furnace. And for him, it was a spiritual struggle and journey. And I like that framing. I think it's complementary to everything I'm talking about and should be a part of the discourse. And so if we talk about something like metamodernism, right, where there's still a lot missing. I've, done the most research to aggregate these things and reintroduce them. I found a paper the other day on meta-colonialism from 2023. And so as if, colonialism, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, those terms aren't enough. And it's useful if we're careful and explicit enough to name these things and be like, yeah, we can, meta-colonialism is still a huge problem. It's kind of very subtle, very ubiquitous, and needs and very hidden, needs to be named. and metacommunism, makes me want to go back and read this guy's works. And I've read some interpretations and commentaries already. It opens the road to that spiritual path, that higher calling, right? We take these ideas of duty and transcendence and creation. And so for him, Kazantzakis was also skeptical because he knew it was a long game. That doesn't mean, don't engage in collective struggle, but he very much embraced it spiritually primarily, which is a kind of unconventional move, because he knew it was a long game. He knew it was part of evolution, like Karl Marx did. So how do you do it? How do you become a communist? How do you build a revolutionary mind? From vibes to revolutionary study. Research, study the theory, study the strategy, study the history, Black and anti-colonial communist traditions, Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton, Thomas Sankara, Walter Rodney. If you have names in your mind of like, oh, I like Milton Friedman, like start to replace those names with more radical names. And, it kind of becomes an emancipatory journey in itself. And you kind of actually scaffold into higher complexity. These are always people that were dealing with more complexity than the hegemonic, liberal, democratic, capitalist status quo. Women, social reproduction and liberation, indispensable part of this. Rosa Luxemburg was both a kind of critic and extension of Marx. Study the theory and study the real world examples, the macro examples, the radical traditions, but then the state experiments. And then you land at the future horizon and another kind of cohort of thinkers and material. Aaron Bastani wrote, the next and final slide is going to be fully automated luxury communism. Paul Cockshott wrote about what's called cyber communism, which at the time when these things were talked about, computers were still in a very early stage. And there was a lot of self-debunking and skepticism, whether that could really work. But I think we're in a totally new era with big data, AI data centers, which are horrible, but there are other ways to make those things and compute the global problems that we're trying to solve. And this horizon is not as far in the future as we think. I mean, the more we avoid it, the more violent and exploitative the short-term horizon is going to be. But the more we can sort of acknowledge, robotics, AI, the political collapse, and the needs of climate change and the needs of people, the way all these things intersect, we need to converge and have consensus as soon as possible, because this is all coming. There's no point, delaying, even though socialism is the goal right now. We can think of that communist horizon in some ways 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years off, because technology is going to continue to change. So there's going to be new horizons, but we should think of other things like universalizing healthcare and education and housing and transportation as right in front of us. So, go read this book, buy my book when it comes out. It's going to be called The Communist Planifesto. And Aaron Bastani also is a journalist for Novara Media in the UK. So I recommend subscribe to communist channels and socialist channels and incorporate that into your media diet and political education. So that's it. I went over a little time, but basically spoke for over an hour. Hope I captured everything there, and we got 19 people hanging out. Let me stop sharing so we can all see each other again. There we go. Feel free to raise a hand, unmute yourself. Thank you for giving me the time and space, letting me ramble on.